Good morning. I'm Charles Chrestman, and I hope you and yours are doing well on this 4th of July weekend. Today we'll be continuing our study in the New Summer Quarterly, which features the book of Proverbs and the Song of Songs. If you would like to follow along on the focal passages we'll be zeroing in on today, you'll need a Bible or a copy of the 2020 Summer Personal Study Guide that was available from Lifeway. If you're ready, we'll get started. Last week our lesson came from Proverbs chapter 4, sometimes known as Solomon's Fourth Discourse. In that lesson we studied the application of practical, moral, and spiritual wisdom. It suggested that we seek it, find it, hold on to it, and make a daily study of it. Wisdom, in turn, will guide us, stabilize us, protect us, and give us a life that is enjoyable and pleasing to our Creator. Today we're moving on to Discourse 5. In this discourse, the father urges his son to avoid every form of promiscuity and to be faithful to his own wife. Some consider the emphasis on the dangers of adultery in this chapter to be too excessive. But many go astray and complicate their lives precisely in this area. A primary purpose of wisdom study is to teach the reader how to avoid self-destruction, and few things are more dangerous than inappropriate sexual behavior. In Proverbs 5, verses 1 through 7, and verse 27, we see that there is a focus on God's wisdom regarding appropriate sexual behavior. Other topics come into view along the way, driving home the necessity of trusting God for His wisdom and applying it to the circumstances of life. Now, although Solomon focused his attention on adultery, the instruction covers a wide range of sexual sins that tempt the believer to ignore God's design and make foolish choices. As you will note, Solomon uses a story to make his points in today's lesson. Today's lesson is going to focus on three important points: seeing the reality of sexual immorality, thinking long term, and enjoying God's provision through marriage. In verse 2, Solomon urged his son to use his lips to pass along godly instruction. In this way, he would preserve wisdom for future generations. Now, in the first section of today's lesson, which is entitled See the Reality, we turn our attention to the focal passages to see what Solomon said next. Follow along with me if you would, please. Though the lips of the forbidden woman drip honey, and her words are smoother than oil, in the end she's as bitter as wormwood and as sharp as a double-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps head straight for Sheol. She doesn't consider the path of life, she doesn't know that her ways are unstable. In verse 3, Solomon told his son what would come from the lips of the forbidden woman. This would have been a woman other than the young man's wife, and she would use her lips and the words that passed through them as tools of seduction. Notice that Solomon told his son in the beginning her speech would be beguiling with the promise of pleasure, but in the end the story would be quite different. Solomon used the analogies of bitter wormwood and a double-edged sword to describe her. Her victims would be left with nothing but extreme bitterness and awful misery. And this was not the worst part of the story. The path of the promiscuous woman leads to death. As Solomon continued to warn his son, he took a close look at the forbidden woman. He described her as a person who had rejected God's wisdom. As a result, she gave no thought to the disaster she would make of her life and that of others. The path a married couple takes can prove to be rewarding if they come to understand that sexual intimacy with only each other renders true and lasting fulfillment. It is one of the life-enriching blessings that comes with living out God's wisdom in marriage. Now that Solomon had issued a warning about the immoral woman, he urged his sons to pay close attention to what he had to say next. Now, the use of the word sons here obviously references other young men in his royal court, because to my knowledge, Solomon only had one son. In our second focal passage today, this is what Solomon said to them about thinking long term. So now, sons, listen to me and don't turn away from the words from my mouth. Keep your way far from her. Don't go near the door of her house. Otherwise, you will give up your vitality to others and your years to someone cruel. Strangers will drain your resources, and your hard-earned pay will end up in a foreigner's house. At the end of your life, you will lament when your physical body has been consumed. In verse 8, Solomon gave the sons two bits of advice. Number 1, keep your way far from her. And number 2, don't go near the door of her house. He did not want the forbidden woman and her tempting ways to pull his sons from their commitment to God. But what would happen to a person who chose to do otherwise? Well, Solomon's answer to this question leaves one with a grim warning that deserves to be taken seriously. Giving in to immorality costs one respect, honor, and dignity. More specifically, Solomon said, you will give up your vitality to others. You will give up your years to someone who is cruel. And strangers will drain you of your resources, and your pay will end up in the house of a foreigner. The scene then shifts from finances to a deathbed. Solomon told his sons that at the end of life they would lament when their physical bodies had been consumed. What a grim warning. In our next section, that's entitled Enjoy God's Provision, we see the skillful use of words by Solomon affirm the unique promise of sexual intimacy in marriage. In our third focal passage, he writes, drink water from your own cistern, water flowing from your own well. Should your springs flow into streets and streams in the public squares? They should be for you alone and not for you to share with strangers. Let your fountain be blessed and take pleasure in the wife of your youth. As you probably noted, Solomon used water to make his point. His example was excellent since water was precious where he lived. As you know, the desert climate does not produce much water. In fact, the climate creates a serious need for it, and without it, nothing survives. By the same token, the health and survival of a marriage relationship depends upon being faithful to one another. Perhaps that's what Solomon had in mind when he mentioned the cistern. A cistern served Solomon well as a word picture that described a wife. In verses 16 and 17, Solomon makes sure to emphasize that God intended the relationship between a husband and wife to be marked by fidelity. In that kind of relationship, intimacy would grow as the couple devoted themselves solely to one another. Finally, Solomon used a fountain to depict how a good marriage renders a blessing for the husband and the wife. Marriage could be the source of endless joy for a couple as they shared life together. In summary, Barnett Brickner said, success in marriage does not come merely through finding the right mate, but through being the right mate. In several ways, this statement supports the point Solomon was making to his sons in today's lesson. There are a number of keys for successful and healthy marriage. Here are a few that most of the experts agree on. Love and commitment, sexual faithfulness, humility, patience and forgiveness, time, honesty and trust, and communication. Obviously, there are more. Most people would never build a house without a set of blueprints. A house simply costs too much, for one thing. Perhaps more importantly, failing to follow a set of blueprints can lead to problems down the road. What Solomon wanted to do for his sons was give them a blueprint for life that was attuned to God's design and would not lead to problems as they lived their lives. There are always standards. for mankind and for marriage. In conclusion, as you know, there are a lot of ways to do things in life. In today's world, we see many who want to craft a design or a plan for their married life that's different from the Creator's plan. Solomon advised God's people to live according to God's design. Life is always more rewarding and fulfilling when you do that. Now, in the way of an epilogue to today's lesson, I wanted to share this with you. According to biblical accounts, Solomon had 700 wives and around 300 concubines. The wives are described as foreign princesses, including the Pharaoh's daughter, and women from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and the Hittites. One account says Solomon simply obsessed with women. The only wife mentioned by name is Naamah, the Ammonite, mother of Solomon's successor, Rehoboam. The biblical narrative notes that Solomon permitted the foreign wives to import their national deities, and he even built temples to Ashtoreth and Milcom. This was not pleasing to God. Of course, we all know the story of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The queen is described as visiting Solomon with a number of gifts that included gold, spices, and precious stones. And we're told that Solomon gave all she asked for according to 1 Kings 10. According to 1 Kings 11, as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to Lord his God. This, along with Solomon building temple to these gods, incurred divine anger and retribution from God, if you go on and read further in chapter 11 of 1 Kings. Despite all of his transgressions, Solomon is associated with the golden age of the independent kingdom of Israel, as well as a source of judicial and religious wisdom. According to Jewish tradition, King Solomon wrote 3 books of the Bible: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. And there are some other books of poetry that bear his name. Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over Israel 40 years and was the last king that ruled over a unified Israel. Quite an interesting character. Let's close today's lesson with a prayer. If you would join me, please. Father, thank you for your guidance and instruction related to your design for marriage. Help us take the key points in today's lesson and grow in our understanding of your will for our lives and our marriages. Thank you for loving us and always being there for us. Amen. Next Sunday, our lesson will be Pursuing Wisdom. I want to thank you for joining us today, and if you have a little time next Sunday, please tune in. You're always welcome, and it's always good to have you. I hope your coming week is a good one.